Sundown is the final episode featuring the temple, and I'll mention a little bit of history here. The temple is a very fascinating building on the island since it's combining a lot of different styles and stories. Most fans would simply chalk up the temple as yet another thing built by the Egyptians, but this is not the case. The temple is a clear Southeast Asian building, built in the Dravidian architecture style seen in Hindu temples in southern India. However, there's a lot of Egyptian iconography within the temple complex, so I'll try to briefly make some sort of timeline combining stuff on screen and my theories. I would categorize the temple into 3 periods: the Egyptian period, the Hindu period, and the modern period. The Egyptian period. Some of the first people who started building things on the island were likely Egyptians, more specifically from Thebes, likely around 1250 BCE. The reason why we have a specific date is due to the papyrus of Ani, a real man who lived in Thebes, who customized the Book of the Dead, and died at that point in time. This papyrus was sealed in his tomb and discovered thousands of years later, but several pages and even direct quotes and spells from his personal Book of the Dead appear on the island. They appear in the Cerberus chamber, the tunnels, the lighthouse, and even here in the temple. We don't know how they wound up on the island. Either these people brought copies of it to the island or passed them down for generations, or maybe a papyrus copy was sealed in a casket that washed up on the beach. Who knows? I've toyed with several ideas about this in this episode, and the unlikelihood that the same people who wrote the Papyrus of Ani wrote the hieroglyphs in the Cerberus chamber, because this is cursive hieroglyphs, and it's usually written on papyrus and not on walls or stone columns. And a lot of these phrases and spells are in a weird order. I don't think the copies of the Papyrus of Ani was the only thing that came to the island, because we have another bullet point in our timeline of the temple carvings. 200 years after Ani died, another man died in Thebes, the priest Bakhtinmut. His Book of the Dead included this image, which is replicated on a wall in the temple. I like the theory that some of the scribes from Thebes passed down some notes to their great-grandchildren or other relatives in Egypt, who would later sail through the Nile and then wind up on the island. They might have started building the underground tunnels and chamber and stored their papyruses there, trying to physically create the pathway to the underworld as described in these papyruses. Realizing that this place is extraordinary, as if Anubis himself would be here. Maybe they even started building a little bit above ground this underground chamber, that they would build this room and add in the Lake of Fire from the Papyrus of Bakhtinmut, as well as the Lake of Fire from the Papyrus of Ani. They wouldn't complete this project and died out. They could have been killed by Mother, since she is not really a big fan of people in general. And if this room was halfway completed, it could have been overgrown and not noticed by the Romans during this period of time. After she died, Jacob would start bringing people from Egypt. It was after the episode Across the Sea that Jacob brought a lot of Egyptians to the island. However, ancient Egypt was now disestablished. It was part of the Roman Empire. The capital was Alexandria. These people could have left port from Alexandria, people with knowledge of the lighthouse, as well as the Metternich Stela, the steel plate that was stored in Alexandria and was replicated in the Cerberus chamber. Jacob certainly told his followers about the light that needs to be protected, since completing those structures is more than a one-man job. One project could be to create a tunnel of water underground that would go to this area over here, which is also one that reacts to metal. They could discover the half-completed building project, the chamber underground, as well as this room over here, which has some very old Egyptian carvings from Ani's papyrus as well as Bakhtinmut, and then made the pool room that would be adjacent to the light underneath the island. This is of course a project that would take a long time. The temple project would be like the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, taking a very long time to be completed. We can also consider the possibility that Man in Black might have invaded or taken over the temple at some point, since he made Egyptians praise him as some sort of smoke god. We see this illustration in the Cerberus chamber and the drawings on the wall, with the Lake of Fire from the underworld, suggesting a very dark chapter of the temple, filled with torture. How could Jacob let this happen? Maybe this happened so early that Man in Black figured out that he could take the form of someone dead. Someone Jacob had brought to the island. One poor Egyptian leader. With the illustrations of the Lake of Fire from the papyruses, as well as this image with Egyptians being smited, suggests a very gruesome chapter at the temple. It doesn't seem like a place of healing. Maybe Jacob assumed things were going well at the temple while he was building a lighthouse, as well as making sure people were building the statue of Taveret. The Egyptians would praise the smoke monster and make a direct connection between Anubis and him in the chamber below. Anubis was already replaced by Osiris at this point in time. However, he could have tricked them and manipulated them into believing that this area is a literal pathway to the underworld and that Anubis is here on the island on the other side of the light. Another set of hieroglyphs we can see in the temple would be this. The translation is as following: the primeval waters of Nun. You can see that this is a match. I believe that this could have been placed on an archway above the temple pool, but I don't think this is the same one. I think the original design was of a simpler Egyptian architectural style. Maybe like this. This was created at a later part and reincorporated this saying. I will come back to this in the next part. Nu or Nun was one of the oldest gods, the personification of the primordial watery abyss, which existed at the time of creation. He represented the waters of chaos out of which Re-Atum began creation. Nun's qualities were boundlessness, darkness, and the turbulence of stormy waters. That sounds pretty dramatic. Was this where he got his final idea from?
I'm sorry if I left out the part about the island being on the bottom of the ocean.
If he saw that Jacob was trying to use the light for his own projects, then he obviously would connect the dots that this pool of water is connected to the light, and by extinguishing the light it would lead to the watery abyss before the creation, that the idea of the island being on the bottom of the ocean was connected to this hieroglyph over here. Did he also place people in the water and then convince them to build the frozen wheel chamber and install the mechanism so that he could go beyond the sea? These experiments could have lasted for years, and he could have gotten people from Greece as well. We know that Greek mythology has been mentioned on the island, with Dharma calling the monster Cerberus, and it's also present on Jacob's tapestry. There might have been some Greeks as well who helped Man in Black with his frozen wheel project. Over time, Jacob discovered that his brother was masquerading as some of his trusted followers. He could drive out the smoke monster as long as he made someone a temple master, as well as circled it with volcanic ash. Or maybe Man in Black himself willingly left when he realized he couldn't manipulate the light at the pool, nor turn the wheel. He couldn't leave the island. He probably killed a bunch of people in the process and went back to his lair, trying to figure out a new plan. The Hindu period. If we assume that Man in Black had control of the temple at some point, then we don't know for how long he manipulated the Egyptians, or when the place stopped being something that worshipped him. There could be a long period where nothing happened here, but Jacob would at some point realize that he could make someone ageless. When he meets Ricardo, he already knows well enough that he has this power. He had to give it to someone else prior to Ricardo to know that it actually worked. So I like the notion that the first temple master became ageless. Jacob had control of the temple and maybe figured out the way to use the heart of the island with the spring to heal his people, so that the depiction of the lake of fire as seen back here is an older illustration. Now this place was no longer the area that worshipped the monster, but a sacred place of healing. They closed down the service chamber, which was connected to a vent. As we saw in Dead is Dead, there were no stairs or entrances down here. They were blocked. They built a tunnel over this area. Then at some point, probably centuries after the Egyptians left or died, a new group came to the island. One candidate I found interesting was Gupta, an Indian name, and maybe this was a temple master, and during Gupta's time they completely remodeled the temple. The Hindus brought with them their knowledge from the home country in terms of building style. Take a look at the real-life Jagannath temple, completed in the year 1161. Just like the temple in Lost, there is an outer wall, and then this area is also protected. Dravidian temples are known for their elaborate entrance gateways, called gopurams. These towering structures are usually highly ornate and embellished with intricate sculptures depicting gods, goddesses, mythical creatures, and scenes from Hindu epics. This is the gopuram in the temple complex. However, compared to these Hindu temples, there's not a lot of ornaments here. The buildings are more standard, more blocky, while the more ornaments are found in the archways as well as the outer wall. This could suggest various building styles. The gopuram is not only connected to the Dravidian style. You can find the gopuram in Khmer building style. Lost loves their stories with different people and nationalities, so I believe there were a lot of different people on the island building the temple, and Cambodian people probably contributed to this. I mean, there were Hindu temples in Cambodia as well. They have the similarities with the courtyard, the outer wall, the gopuram and so on. But the building style is a little bit simpler, with another key element in the buildings is the vimana, which is above the sacred place. It would be this tower here. Vimanas house the Sanctum Sanctorum, or Garbhagriha, which is the innermost sanctuary of Hindu temples, what may be called the Holy of Holies, or Sanctum Sanctorum. Just like the temple on Lost, there's an outer wall, and then this area is also protected. So the Hindus started building. They created a wall around the two existing chambers and rebuilt the roof above their Garbhagriha, their Sanctum Sanctorum. They would also use the existing hieroglyphs to make this arch, as well as the hidden doorway. Just like Dharma paid respects to the Egyptians by writing this in hieroglyphs instead of in English, the Hindus did the same. They carved this impressive arch, and Indian-style temples have these doorways and archways that are richly decorated with bands of figural, floral, and geometrical ornaments. On both sides, we have a three-headed creature. Does this confirm that there was a presence of the monster at the temple at some point, and that Greek mythology seeped its way into the temple design? Because the only three-headed creature I can think of is Cerberus, the three-headed dog who guarded the underworld in Greek mythology. They also erected this pyramid structure, which is their gopuram. This one could be very similar to the Kocher temple. And they also erected this small statue of the Trimurti, the Trinity of the Supreme Divine in Hinduism. The Trimurti collapses the three gods Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva into a single form with three faces. Each god is in charge of one aspect of creation, with Brahma as creator, Vishnu as preserver, and Shiva as destroyer. Scholars consider the doctrine of the Trimurti to be an attempt to reconcile different approaches to the divine with each other, and with a philosophical doctrine of ultimate reality. The Hindus created a wall around their temple and added hieroglyphs to it as well. In the end, both Gupta and the other builders died. By the time we come to Abaterno, Jacob is trying to get new people here again, this time on the Black Rock. Man in Black kills them all with the exception of Ricardo. This will begin the new era, the modern era. After Ricardo's arrival, Jacob stepped up his game again. Newer people came to the island, new civilizations. Ricardo became Richard Alpert, and together with Jacob, they started looking for a new leader of their community. I think that they also decided to go for a temple master again. Maybe Jacob realized the power of the ash, as well as having a temple master there, would be sufficient in keeping the Man in Black out. As we learn at the end of this episode, after Dogen was killed, the smoke monster was finally free to enter. Either Claire made sure that the ash was broken when she entered the temple, or Lennon was telling the truth, that Dogen's death let him in. Dogen being like some sort of pope in the temple, like a leader of the others' religion, but not necessarily their entire community. He was bound to this place, as Jesus told Peter in the Bible, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Man in Black always figured out to kill Jacob's followers in the past, and the temple master also died. Jacob didn't have a well-defined system for the people he brought to the island. When Richard was the intermediary, the temple continued existing as its own sacred place. And if the temple master leaves its compound, there is a possibility that the Man in Black will find a way to kill him or her. So even though they had temple masters before, they can't solely rely on the temple master being a leader of the others. They need a leader on the island to actually take charge and do stuff on the island. This was needed, since in the coming century the others would face a lot of situations. So the temple master became this secluded position, one whom people didn't talk about, a guy who didn't go to, for instance, Juliet's execution or to witness John Locke trying to kill his father. The temple master was never going to be part of this. That's the rule. I discussed in an earlier video that Reynolds could have been a temple master, since young Ben would have known about this in his time with the others, and he was in high school age and got a mental image of Reynolds as some sort of principal at the temple, and that image stuck in the afterlife. In Dr. Linus asked complaints about working with equipments from the 1950s, so I'll propose the theory that Reynolds became the temple master in the 1950s. In the 70s, the Dharma Initiative came to the island and found the temple. They noted it down on the map and wanted to create a station there to study the ancient pool of healing water, but they were denied. The place was sacred to the natives, and they were never allowed to get in or to do experiments there. When Reynolds retired or died, Jacob would travel to Osaka and then offer the job to someone else. We don't know when, but based on Hiroyuki Sanada's interviews, he said that Dogen has been there for over 15 years. And that's the history of the temple. I'll add parts of this in an upcoming video that will come out closer to Across the Sea, which will deal with the history of the island. Let's go back to the episode. Let's start with an off-screen trek. Ilana's team have now buried John Locke and will start on a big trek across the island. They will pass the Gold Coast Valley and a lot of the jungle. Richard is also on his way to the temple, but he'll arrive there a little bit later. Said barges into Dogen's chamber. Dogen tells him that he believes him to be evil. The discussion escalates into a fight. Dogen tells Said to leave and never come back. As Said is preparing to leave, Claire enters the temple at the behest of the man in black and tells Dogen to come out and speak with him. We learn something interesting in this episode about the relationship between the temple master and the man in black. The man in black doesn't enter the temple. We already know about the ash and that it's something he can't cross. He sends Claire and she says this.
No, he wants you to go to him. He's waiting outside beyond the outer wall.
I'm not a fool. If I step outside this temple, he'll kill me.
Dogen refuses. If he leaves, he'll be killed, and then asks Said to come back to his chamber. He gives him the dagger. Dogen will likely instruct Said about the pathway to the outer wall, as well as tell him about the stone door. Remember, Said was unconscious when he was brought here. He has never been here before. Dogen will tell him about the door that Richard Alpert used in Season 5, and that will lead to a small hallway and an exit on the other side, where he will find the man in black. Said leaves the temple to meet the man in black and on his way encounters Kate. I think that when he meets Kate, they are both in that area inside the temple wall. But when Said meets Man in Black Locke later, he has exited the temple wall. Claire told Dogen that the Man in Black was waiting outside the temple outer wall. He goes through the door into the jungle and hears the smoke monsters surround him. Said stabs him with a dagger given to him by Dogen to no effect. The question is, would it have worked? The answer is no. It's not like the Man in Black is vulnerable before he says any words. The thing about words and letting someone speak is more in the vein of persuasion and the power of speech. We see the effect Jacob's speech had on Ricardo. Man in Black is mad that he let him talk to him.
You let him talk to you, didn't you?
He can be very convincing.
Said let Man in Black Locke talk to him, and that drove Said on the dark side even further. In a few hours he will kill Dogen and Lennon. Desmond's speech to Said later in the season had the opposite effect. I think that is what is meant by not letting them speak. It's not a physical weakness of the monster. The Man in Black tells him that he can resurrect Nadia. Said goes back through the stone door and into the temple complex again. Upon returning to the temple, Kate learns from Miles that Claire is there, and finds her having been captured by the others in a hole inside the temple. I've placed the location over here based on the movements by our characters. These hallways have been rotated and reused since they can't make an entire temple inside the studio. She tells Claire about Aaron.
He wants you to know that Jacob is dead. And because he's gone, none of you have to stay here any longer. You're free.
Dogen gets inside, Said returns to the temple courtyard, resulting in many others leaving the temple, including Cindy, Zack and Emma. In all of this commotion, Ilana's group have arrived at the outer wall of the temple. They wait until the coast is clear and go inside. Said goes here into the spring, or the Sanctum Sanctorum, where he meets Dogen. Dogen reveals to him about his past life. After he tells Said this, Said kills him. Lennon then walks in and is killed by Said. Immediately after Dogen's death, the monster enters the temple and begins killing everyone. Just as he arrives, Ilana's team arrive at the temple and they sneak past the monster and go straight for Dogen's chamber. They meet Miles. The group go through the corridor and towards the Hall of Hieroglyphs, while Ben goes to find Said. Meanwhile, the monster has entered this area, Kate is here and he passes right over here. And here comes the explanation for this extremely long hallway behind this whole complex. The monster is going through the entire temple, killing everyone. Ben finds Saeed in the pool room and Saeed refuses to come with him. Then the monster has turned around this corner. Ilana is looking at the hall of hieroglyphs. She finds the Shen ring and they all leave. The monster comes through the hallway and enters the pyramid-shaped structure again, the so-called Gopuram, and turns back into the form of John Locke. Meanwhile, Kate finds Claire and together the two of them, along with Saeed, exit the temple to meet the Man in Black. Next week is the final Ben episode of the season, but since we don't have a lot of tricks going on in this episode, I want to do something more about his character. I want to cover the missing pieces of Ben's life, the rise and fall of Ben as a leader. So we're going a little bit deeper into his character in Dr. Linus and explore the unexplored. Stay tuned, please like, share and subscribe to this channel.